What was the best you have no power here moment you have ever seen? Story 1. I used to work for a super cunny manager when I worked at McDonald's. This guy was horrible to us. He was constantly bullying us, talking us to customers, and doing everything in his power to make us miserable. Well, so many people complained about him that he ended up getting fired. The new manager was great. He was super chill and understanding with us all. A couple weeks after he took over, the old douchebag comes in and starts talking about how terrible the store looks, how our service is shittier than ever, and how much this store needs him. The new manager looked at him and said, "If you don't leave, then the cops are going to make you." When the douchebag didn't move, new awesome manager stuck to his guns and called the cops. The douchebag is no longer allowed on any McDonald's property in the city and has a restraining order against him. Story 2. The first time I had dinner at my parents' house after I got my own apartment, my dad was giving me grief as usual. Finally, I stood up and said, "I don't live here anymore. I don't have to put up with you this way any longer. I'm going home," and walked out. Most liberating moment of my life. Story 3. Well, this might be a long one. I grew up around a mother with dissociative disorder as well as narcissism. She was addicted to opiates as far back as I can remember and would do anything to get them. And I mean anything. Growing up, it wasn't rare for her to have a tantrum during one of her highs and beat the out of me, break me down by picking apart every little thing she knew I was afraid or self-conscious of, and actively sabotage my relationship with my father and siblings. She would be up for days at a time, pass out standing up with her eyes glassed over and back hunched, and when she festered once again, start moving and otherwise destroying everything in the house. There were times where I'd leave, and the house would be clean, and come home and it would look as though a pissed-off tornado had run through the house that is broken glass, animal feces, dirty clothes, roaches, empty pill bottles, ground-up pill residue, and other miscellaneous things littering the house. On particularly bad nights, she would hallucinate, and during those times it wouldn't be uncommon to find pools of her blood on the ground from running through glass. I remember being up for days at a time because her and my father would scream at each other for days at a time without stopping, actively trying to get me to pick one side or the other, even if it meant barging into my room at 4 a.m. to begin their screaming match where I could watch. She manipulated me, abandoned me at times in the middle of nowhere when she'd meet up with her various sugar daddies. She was still with my dad during this, and never once apologized during her brief moments of mental clarity. If anything, she would blame everything but herself. In her mind, she was infallible. Money was always a big issue since she couldn't work in such a state. She sold some of her pills, yes, but ultimately those funds were used to buy more anyway. Because of this, we were homeless frequently, without power and water for literally years at a time, and barely ever had any food. It was almost every night I went to sleep with the only thing I'd have eaten that day being a school lunch. On weekends, sometimes I didn't eat at all. The rest of my family had no clue this was happening. During the summer when I was 16, my aunt, whom I hadn't talked much with since I was a lot younger, got in touch. She asked if I'd like to come to stay with them in Texas for a few weeks during the summer. Of course I said yes, and I was absolutely ecstatic. I didn't bother asking my parents, since I'd be very much surprised if they even noticed I was gone, so they were unaware. My aunt drove up all the way to Iowa and stayed the afternoon with us. My parents seemed to lack the cognition to recognize she was even there out of the blue, so they didn't come out of their room. As I stated before would happen frequently, when she arrived, our house was fairly clean. We left for a bit to go get food, and when we returned, the tornado had already passed. As she told me when we were on our way to Texas, the thing that bothered her the most wasn't that our house had suddenly gone to hell. It was that I didn't even react to it. Instead, I tiptoed around the debris and started packing my things without a word. This deeply unsettled her, and ultimately she asked me if I was safe where I lived. I said yes, as it was all I had ever known. She told me that what she saw frightened her, and she wanted me to come live with her in Texas. Thinking that she was joking, I brushed it off. After a few days down there, though, I knew I had to do it. They showed me love, compassion, and care that I'd never even known existed prior to this, and it shook me to my core. So we decided I was going to get emancipated from my parents and move in with them. Ultimately, this involved sitting in a courthouse across from my parents and their lawyer. The judge asked why I wanted to leave, and I explained the above. I expressed the love and compassion I'd experienced for the first time in my life, and that I wanted to, for once, live in peace. Their lawyer rebutted, "To me, it seems as though you have no respect for your parents. Is it because of their financial situation? It looks as though you're attached to the perks of living in a family that makes a reasonable amount of money, and not that you want to leave because they're unfit parents." My mother and father joined in, hooting and hollering actively, trying to break me down as they have so many times before. I let them speak. and I held my tongue until it was my turn. They tried to goad me on, tried to break me as they had so many times before, but I wouldn't let them. Finally, the judge asked me to speak. With as level a stare as I could muster, I looked at Mother, my father, and their lawyer across from me and said, "If you're asking me if I have no respect for my parents, then you are correct. However, to say it's simply financially motivated is incorrect. I no longer have respect for them because they have." As I was nearly finished, my mother, as she had so many times in the past, began to squirm and scream at me from across the table. "He's lying, the little bastard is just—" Until the judge slammed his gavel down and cut the room, my mother staring up at him in complete and utter disbelief. I looked at her, keeping the tears I knew were right behind the corner at bay, and said, "For once in your life, for once in my life, behave as an adult. You can't stop me by simply yelling over me anymore. You have nothing to hold over me now. You can do nothing." As I spoke, the judge motioned to his officer, who moved toward my mother, her expression still frozen in complete bewilderment, as the officer aggressively told her to get up out of her chair and escorted her out of the room. The judge looked to me, my aunt, my father, and his lawyer with one sweeping glance and then spoke. "I am sorry that you have had to deal with this for so long, young man. There's nothing more that you or anyone else needs to say. You deserve to live a normal life as a normal kid, and it's obvious to me now that your parents are unfit to produce that kind of environment. You will go back to Texas with your aunt, and we will regularly have our social workers in touch to check in on how you are doing. Make the most of this second chance. Good luck, young man." Adjourned. Though the bang of his gavel was the only noise that permeated the room, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. My father and his lawyer were escorted out of the room, and the tears I had held back all this time came gushing out like a tidal wave. It's been 7 years since that day, and I am happy to say that I've managed to grow up and become a well-adjusted adult. I have a great career, great friends, and an amazing girlfriend. I've been in therapy ever since we got back to Texas, and I no longer have trouble sleeping or terrible bouts of anxiety and depression as I used to. Life is good. Tell Dyer. Mother is a narcissist with dissociative personality disorder addicted to opiates. Father kind of just went with the flow and didn't really do much. Aunt came down to take me to Texas, saw how everything was, and asked me if I wanted to live with them. After some time, I said yes, went to court against my parents under the pretense of emancipation, and got to stare them down and lay out all the trauma, pain, and fear they've caused me. My mother was escorted out of the room when she tried to cut over me, and the judge sided with us and I was emancipated. Now I'm doing really well. Story 4. I told my ex I was getting remarried. He told me he was going to stop me and put a lane on my house, which I bought with my money 6 years after the divorce. My son would come home from visitations telling me how his dad was going to stop the wedding, and I'd have to pay him all of this money, la-di-da. Get to court. His attorney goes blah, blah, blah for what felt like forever. My lawyer, yes, I had to freaking get one, stands up and simply hands the judge the divorce papers showing the disbursement of funds and how my ex isn't owed anything. Judge looks at ex's lawyer and basically asks, "Did you even ask for this document before filing?" and dismisses the case. Story 5. A while back, I got a job as a popcorn monkey in the local cinema as a temporary thing while I figured out what I was doing with my life. There was a supervisor that had worked there since the site opened, around 5 years, who was a total and had had numerous complaints about her from countless staff. In the first week, I nearly quit because of her attitude. As an example, one night I was on a close and basically cleaned the entirety of the front of house on my own. I stopped to take a drink of water and she marched up to me going, "We don't pay you to stand around drinking, you know." To which I calmly responded that I was thirsty and needed a drink of water, and if she wanted to tell me I wasn't allowed to have a glass of water, then good luck. But I'm pretty sure health and safety would have something to say about that. She huffed about not having had a break all day, which I ignored because not my problem. But internally, I was put out about it, because it was totally pointless to be such a twat about things. About 2 weeks in, I get promoted to supervisor, as I was clearly extremely competent by their usual standards. I could walk and fart at the same time. But she also gets promoted to floor manager, so she continues to work her little power trips and try and lord it over me and everyone else. 4 weeks after that, I get another promotion to floor manager, and at this point we're equals, so she can't boss me around anymore. So instead, she tries a different tack, which is to try and lord it over me with her superior knowledge of processes, where to find stuff, etc. My response is to go, saccharine sweet. "Oh, thanks. That's so helpful. I mean, you know how things work so much better than me because you've been here 5 years, and I've only been here 6 weeks. She had a face like a smacked arse. It was delightful. Story 6. X and I were moving out after a breakup, cleaning out garage, She was being critical of my post-breakup plan of moving in with a coworker until I could find a better place to live, as most options weren't great. I took a deep breath and laughed. This puzzled her. "Why are you laughing?" she asked. I collected myself and said, "Because this is the last time I have to listen to this. You don't get to be critical of anything I ever do, ever again." It was a really great feeling because I literally thought of the "you have no power here" as I laughed. Story 7. TLDR, a pair of angry moms threatened legal action if I fired their useless kids. I work for a trampoline park franchise. We opened a sister location that I ran for about a year and a half before moving back to take over the old location. When I got back, a lot needed fixing, but in particular, there were 2 teenage employees that had been fired, suspended on numerous occasions. They were generally lazy, rude jackasses that shouldn't have been hired in the first place. Problem was, they both had aggressive helicopter moms that intimidated the manager into rescinding any punishments. Once I came back, I took stock of our employees and had a long talk with the entire leadership team. I learned which employees caused which problems, who was unreliable, who had a regular habit of skipping shifts, texting on shift, etc. I fired about a half dozen that first week, including those 2 I mentioned. That night, both moms called my personal cell to scream at me. Our numbers are listed in the online scheduling tool so employees can find shift covers more easily. They demanded to know why I fired them, threatened to sue, have me arrested, accuse me of discrimination against their white middle-class sons, etc. I simply asked, "Is your son over 18, yes? So you're demanding I illegally release personal information regarding a former adult employee? Bye." Story 8. Not me, but a story my dad used to tell me all the time. So my biological grandmother was very emotionally abusive. She was very controlling and tried to keep people within her sphere of influence. There's a reason why my grandfather divorced her. In high school, my dad had a job washing airplanes at an airport in our area, which he absolutely loved. He's a huge fan of aircraft in general. He had classes until roughly 10 a.m. and then he'd be off to work until around 10 p.m. It was what he loved. He didn't mind long hours being around aircraft all day. But one day he came home a little too late for his mom's liking. She said she'd take his keys to his motorcycle and that he'd lost privileges to it. The fact of the matter is that he bought the motorcycle himself and he needed it to get to school as well as work. He laughed in her face and she didn't do anything. She couldn't do anything. Story 9, I'm a high school teacher who teaches a lot of senior grades and so has to deal with graduation grades, references for university, all that jazz. I had a parent of a graduating kid in my classroom in June, after final marks were given to students but not formally reported, who was a dental surgeon in town, ran a large operation, donated a lot to local sports, big man in a small town. I'd given his kid a mark in the high B range, and so he marched into my office and started off with the "there must be some mistake" line, which moved swiftly into the "you're going to change it because I tell you to "how much will it cost to get him the A?" When I refused the bribe, he went to "you're fired. One. Not "I'm going to get you fired," but "you're fired, clean out your desk." I just asked him to leave. Ended badly, he threatened violence. I reported him to the school admin. He's now banned from the property. "Mister, I pay your salary so you work for me, you lousy piece of S***. It was threatened with the cops by Mr. Random Act PG. Story 10. Ooh, I have a story for this. I got married 2 years ago overseas because my wife is from Europe, and they have cool castles, and my Canadian family and friends all came over because most had never been. We're a little older and well off, so we splurged. Wedding was awesome. Dinner amazing. Reception is in full swing, and quite frankly, it's a little warm. Warm for us Canadians. It was around 10°C in early November. When you mix in wool suits, drinking, and lots of dancing, some of us colonists were working up a bit of a sweat. Thankfully, the venue had a balcony with huge doors. I kept going over and opening them as some folks were inside, some were outside, and there was a nice breeze, but I had to keep going over because they were shut whenever I looked back. Finally, after the 5th or 6th time, this guy followed me and demanded I keep the doors shut because it was cold inside. I didn't know who he was, so he must have been a +1 of someone on my wife's side. So I was mighty confused when he said, and I quote, "Who the hell do you think you are keeping these doors open and the temperature so low inside?" "I'm the guy who bought you dinner." I watched him go over to my now cousin-in-law and grab his coat and almost pull her out the front door. I thought one of my groomsmen was going to burst, he laughed so hard. Story 11. This is a bit silly, but gave me a great feeling of satisfaction. Due to the bad economy and poor money management, my parents have moved into the spare room of the house my husband and I bought a year ago. Things are mostly smooth, though I'm not the closest to them for several reasons I won't go into here. The other evening I was out gardening because it's hot during the day and we have the luck of having a street light right next to our front yard. keeping it pretty well illuminated even after sundown. I mostly garden at night. And I thought I had gotten the hose twisted, as it kept getting stuck. This went on for a bit when I realized that it wasn't stuck, but being pulled. I looked into the dim area just past the illumination of the streetlight and spied my father, crouched over and tugging the hose. Well, I did the only reasonable thing to do, and I sprayed him. He yelled and ran inside with me chasing. Once he got inside, he made a face and goes, "You can't get me now. I'm inside," in that father-to-daughter, don't you make a mess tone of voice. I readied my hose, looked him in the eye and said, "It's my house," and just let loose with the hose. He was soaked, worth cleaning up the mess for that moment of true fear in his eyes. Edit. Thanks for all the appreciation. I'm glad my silly story made your day better. Story 12. I had a short stint as private investigator who specialized in providing investigative services to public defenders. We had this one county that was notorious for a sheriff's department that would make BS traffic stops as a pretext to search vehicles. One deputy in particular came up time and time again for this kind of thing. I was asked to interview this deputy for a defense attorney. Deputy had some of the worst report writing skills I've ever seen, riddled with grammar and spelling errors. Quite often, Deputy wouldn't even include the reason he pulls people over in his reports. So I go to interview the guy. As part of the process, there's a senior sheriff's rep there that basically is supposed to protect deputies from people like me and keep them from saying things they shouldn't. We sit down, and I pull out his report he wrote on the stop he made on my client's defendant. I've already marked it up, English teacher style with a red pen, and start with, "I had some trouble understanding your report." I proceeded to go error by error for the purpose of clarifying the report. He's getting redder and redder. I then go into trying to determine why he pulled over the defendant because it's unclear in the report. He's not able to give a definitive response. All the while, the sheriff's rep, whom I've worked with a lot and who I have seen be very vocal protecting deputies in interviews like this in the past, is silent. Ultimately, charges against client are dropped. Months later, I'm driving through the area on the way home from camping, not speeding or breaking any traffic laws. I get pulled over by a deputy. It's the same deputy. He recognizes me immediately, stammers, and manages to say, "It's almost dusk. Turn on your headlights." He gets back in his vehicle and takes off before I've even started my engine. Story 13. I grew up with my parents having screaming arguments over every little thing. They do love each other. Over 50 years of marriage so far testifies to that, and it always upset me. A couple of days ago, they popped into my house to visit for a coffee on their way to stay with friends a few miles away. Within minutes, they were yelling at each other. I took great pleasure in telling them that I would not stand for such behavior in my house, and if they didn't lower their voices, they could stand outside until they learned some manners. The meek apologies tasted so sweet, as did the coffee. Story 14. I worked in management at a theater for a while. If the concession counter was slammed and I was able, I'd leave my post and help them sling popcorn. One night while helping out, a particularly belligerent man started cussing out a 16-year-old girl on a cash register for being too slow, even suggesting she quit since she clearly couldn't handle pushing buttons or scooping popcorn. It was pretty disgusting, and I felt so bad for the girl I stepped in and told the guy that our employees have the right to refuse service to customers who harass them as part of our anti-harassment/discrimination policy, empathized that the lines were longer than usual, and suggested he should apologize and move on. He was pissed, left half his order on the counter and started fuming off. Anticipating his next move, I went back to my original post that night as manager of the customer service kiosk. Oh boy, the look on his face when he saw me. Didn't want a refund of his tickets though, so I assume he watched the movie without popcorn. Story 15. When I was in high school, I worked at Popular Warehouse Club selling computers on the weekends. I was hired by the store manager via referral of a friend. I loved computers, and they thought I'd make a good salesman. So my job was to stay in the computer department and sell computers, nothing else. Well, one of the shift managers didn't like that and insisted that I needed to go fold clothes for a while, as in half my damn shift. I told him that the store manager had instructed me never to leave the technology department, but he insisted. This went on for several weeks. The store manager showed up one weekend when both the power trip and shift manager and I were working. The store manager walks up with the shift manager close behind. Store manager slaps a stack of green bar paper, this was a while ago, down onto a shelf and points to some highlighted numbers. He looks at the shift manager and says, "Do you see this? This is our average technology sales numbers for the weeks you're on shift. See this number over here? This is our average technology sales numbers for weeks you are not. At this point, it would be more cost-effective for me to simply fire you. What do you think of that solution?" The guy stammers and stutters like a toddler caught bullying another kid on the playground. Fortunately, the dude wasn't fired, But the store manager made it clear that when I was on shift, I was not to leave the technology department unless I was on break or there was a fire in the store. That shift manager never said another word to me. Story 16. A few years ago, a guy stopped me in the hardware store and asked if I was a painter. I looked down at my painter's whites and said, yeah, I do historical restoration work. He asked how much I charge per hour, and when I told him, he immediately told me I was too expensive and dropped my rate by 25%. I'd already given him my number, but he kept belittling me and saying I wasn't worth it. I just told him that I already had a full-time job, and this would be in my off hours, so it needed to be worth my while. He finally let me leave the store, then called me 3 or 4 times, each time hemming and hawing over if he wanted to actually use me or not. He's got a bunch of properties. It would be a sweet gig, but not at those prices. And I just kept telling him that's fine. Don't use me if you don't want to. Eventually, I recognized his number and stopped picking up. He really thought he had some sort of power over me, and I'd jump at the opportunity. Luckily, I didn't have to take the work. I was making good enough money as it was. He would have nitpicked absolutely everything and probably not paid me at the end anyway. But he was so certain he'd have power in the situation that he didn't seem able to comprehend me not wanting to barter with him. Story 17. Worked in a cell phone store, both selling devices and service contracts in the UK. Some kid, 19-ish maybe, came in with a much shorter man who I later learned was his dad. For whatever reason, I forget what now, he wanted to cancel out of a contract he was partway through. Now I could already tell from the way the kid explained it in exasperated terms that he knew he couldn't cancel out of it, but his dad wasn't taking his word for it and had dragged him in to try and sort it out for him. The contracts clearly state you can't cancel prematurely without paying off the rest of your dues, which I explained, and his father just went full boomer rage mode on me. Spitting, frothing, hurling vitriol. This guy clearly thought this was how you got things done. I stared him down, waited for him to finish, and repeated the contractual terms as stated. He hit me back with, "I'll report you for violating the Sale of Goods Act." Sucks to be him, because I had that memorized. I made a point of it, in fact, after the first few customers in my early days tried to bring it up to get their own way. Some chode on the internet had made posts about how you could sling the term around and usually scare retailers into doing what you want, because they don't know it either, so it happened a lot, even when there was absolutely no call for it. I just looked at him and said, "Sure, go ahead. You can even use our phone," and pointed at the store phone right next to him. I knew he didn't have a leg to stand on, and any trade commissioner listening to his claim would laugh him off the line. He clearly had absolutely no idea how to proceed. After a moment of blank staring, he just turned and stormed out with his son rolling his eyes so far back into his head he could probably see his own brain in embarrassment at his dad's tantrum. Story 18. I work in an NHS hospital. No one pays anything out of pocket for treatment here. It's all paid for through taxation. A patient was added onto our clinic who had paid one of our doctors for surgery privately at another hospital, but she was getting her follow-ups free on the NHS. Technically, this shouldn't happen, but it does. These patients can be a bit difficult. This lady's appointment was at 8:55 before we even started at 9 o'clock. She had her workup done when we actually clocked in and was all snooty about waiting 5 whole minutes, bearing in mind she's saving a fortune. Then one of the nurses from the ward called, and an actual NHS patient needed seen urgently, so they were brought up and seen ahead of the private patient. Well, this woman went mental, started shouting and bawling that she'd paid all this money and she demanded service. Our charge nurse went out, demanded to know who had taken money off of her, really drilled the patient to point to the person who had dared take money off of an NHS patient. Well, the woman went beetroot, stuttered that she had paid the other hospital, and the charge was like, "Exactly, your money is no good here, and doctor is being paid by the taxpayer to see this emergency patient first, so kindly sit down and be quiet, or leave my department until you can be civil." Story 19. My dad is 6'3". I'm 6'10". Sometime in my early teens, I shot past him. Dad was a yeller, not doing what he thought I should be. No discussion, just yell. But I realized at some point that he wouldn't yell at me if he had to look up while he was doing it. I don't remember what our last argument was about. I just remember that I'd sort of caught on at this point. So I'm in my room in front of the computer. Dad comes in and starts yelling at me. I eventually stand up and start yelling back. Dad makes an excuse to leave. Dad comes back about a half hour later and starts yelling again. But at this point, it's all I can do to not just laugh. I know that the instant I stand up, the argument will end. It actually wound up being really good for our relationship, because Dad realized that he actually had to make valid points, rather than just going into former drill sergeant mode. Edit. Obligatory. This blew up, etc., etc. It looks like I unintentionally may have hit a raw nerve for a lot of people, for which I apologize. And I don't think that I had it anywhere near as bad as some of the people who replied. All I can say is that if you find yourself in a situation where you've got parents whose first response is intimidation or worse, look at how most people who responded eventually got out of the situation. Hang in there, it gets better, and you can find people who will help you if that's what is necessary. Story 20, probably watching a few Texas DPS officers realize they couldn't shut down a whole airport. I was working as a flight instructor at small airport on a Saturday afternoon. We had one plane that had an issue on takeoff and veered off the runway. It cartwheeled and totaled the airplane, but fortunately the pilot was not seriously injured. I had a student who was next in line for takeoff when it happened. He called me from his phone as it happened. I hopped in the airport car with one of the rampers and drove out to the plane with a radio to inform inbound planes to use the other runway. We had no control tower. On the way to the runway, I called the airport manager who drove to the airport, and on his way, he made a phone call to officially close that runway. About 30 minutes later, a metric fuckton of DPS officers showed up and immediately tried to close the whole airport, treating it like a giant crime scene. They were carelessly driving around the airport like they owned the place, ignoring the planes that were moving around and crossing our only open runway without regard to inbound traffic. A mechanic and I tried to tell them to be careful, and they got mad at us. One of them told me they were locking it down a couple times, meaning the whole airport. Now I was a broke-ass flight instructor, and I had a flight that afternoon that was ultimately going to help pay for me to eat that week. The airport manager was a short, stereotypical country guy, also former Navy. He was not intimidated at all by the cops trying to close his airport. When he showed up, I was about to go out with a student who was pre-flighting for across country. There were about 5 cops in the lobby, me with my flight bag, the airport manager, and a mechanic. One of the cops saw my flight bag and said, "I don't know why you have that or why he's out of the plane. You aren't going anywhere." The moment he finished his sentence, the airport manager said, "It's one runway that's closed. The airport is still open." This pissed off the cops. I was about to head out the door, and one of the officers said he was driving out to the disabled plane. Idke, the pilot, had been gone for about an hour. The mechanic said, "You need to be careful," and the cop quickly retorted, "And why the hell is that?" And he said, "Because this is still an airport, and the first thing that hits you is going to be a propeller." A few seconds later, a plane took off as one of the cars was approaching the runway intersection, ironing in that point. I walked out, and as I was hopping in the plane with my student, the same cop came up to me and said, "You aren't going anywhere. We're locking this down." I looked at the airport manager, who followed all of us out to the ramp. He said, "Have a nice flight, Ajax Bew." You could see these cops just fuming that they didn't have the authority to close down an entire airport because one plane went off the runway. The airport had 2 runways. Where the disabled plane was located was probably a mile or so away from the open runway. Why they were making a big fuss, I don't know. The occupant was relatively uninjured. His wife was the worst thing he had to deal with that day. He told her he wasn't going to fly. We had a good flight, and I got to eat dinner that week. Story 21. I personally had one that I'm quite proud of. I was one of 2 mechanics responsible for an annual inspection on a Piper Aero fixed wing prop aircraft. Aside from dismal compression ratios and some odds and ends in the aircraft that could be overlooked by technicality, there was a problem with the main landing gear motor. The down and lock cycle for that aircraft is required by the OEM, and by extension federal law, to be 30 seconds or less across one cycle of the motor. This plane's gear requires 3 to 5 cycles across about 2 minutes to achieve down lock. I told the owner, who was a famously sleazy lawyer, that he can't fly his plane and I won't sign off the annual until the main landing gear are fixed. The lawyer told me to sign off the annual and he'll get to fixing the gear some other time. When I said no, he proceeded to threaten my job and demanded to have the plane back so he could get another mechanic to sign it off as airworthy. I laughed in his face, impounded his aircraft, and notified the FAA. The man eventually gave his aircraft to my business I was working for at the time by way of title lien, in order to pay off the massive hangar fees he racked up from his plane sitting in my shop. Story 22. I was a salesman at a wire and cable place. I got a call Friday morning from a tow truck driver freaking out. He needed a replacement cable for his truck ASAP because the weekends were the big business days for him, bragging about the big money and people who leave their cars somewhere overnight because they're too drunk to drive home. He was and rude the whole time we were on the phone. He demanded that the cable be cut and shipped immediately, sent next day air, Saturday delivery. Pretty expensive. I rushed his order, ran back to the warehouse to hand it to the manager myself to make sure it could jump in line and get cut before the next day air guy showed up. But we did it, rushed every part of it, and got it shipped out in time. Every person involved prioritized this order to get it out to him on time. Tow truck dude calls me back later that afternoon saying he got the truck working and no longer needs the cable. He asked to cancel the order and get a refund. I explained to him that because he had it cut to a specific length, if we were to take it back, there would be a restock fee because we're not going to be able to resell it until someone needs that exact specific length. I also explained that I can't refund the shipping costs because the order has already been shipped the way he demanded it be sent out. Dude loses his mind, screaming at me, telling me he's going to give the company terrible reviews everywhere and tell all his friends how we're all pieces of. There was literally nothing I could do for him. No amount of him being in could uncut and unship that order. Story 23. My job right before my current one. Property manager, the owner was an absolute. He was heartless and rude and racist, and I loathed him. I hated every day going into that job, but I needed the money. I was applying daily to my dream company in hopes that eventually I'd be accepted. In the meantime, every time I complained or mentioned something to my supervisor, I was told to shut up and get on with it. He was paying me too much to have opinions. 3 years after, we were a small office and the receptionist and assistant prop managers had quit. I finally got accepted into my dream company and happily put in my 2-week notice. In desperation, he offered me more money, a higher position, better benefits, which were laughable. When I said no, he asked why. I have never felt more gleeful than the moment of when I said, I don't know. I'm not paid to have opinions here. That was a year ago. And even now, the look on his stupid old face gives me joy to this day. Edit, typo, and obligatory. Didn't expect this to blow up, but yeah, I'm petty. What's new? LOL, thanks for the awards. To those who mentioned, this was a very brief, summarized version, and yes, he did remember saying it to me. He told me I was being too sensitive and should take more money. I've kept in touch with my awesome supervisor, and in the year since I've left, the position has yet to be filled. Everyone keeps quitting because they can't work with someone like him. So bahahaha. Edit 2. Also, since a few people asked, the new job, a yearish in, is doing great and still to this day almost cry at the thought that I have benefits that include health insurance and a boss that doesn't call me sweetie in a tone that indicates I can't chew gum and walk at the same time. Story 24. A coworker friend of mine was flying back from a sales conference in Vegas, and he was able to upgrade to a first-class seat. We had this sales VP that was on the same flight. She was the snobby, entitled type with a full-time nanny and giant McMansion in the suburbs, and she generally treated people who worked for her like servants. She sees him in a first-class seat as she is making her way to coach and asks him how he got that seat. He used points to upgrade. As people are getting settled in, she makes her way back up to the first-class cabin and asks to speak with the lead flight attendant. She tells him that one of her underlings is sitting in first class and that she needs to switch with him since she's higher on the corporate ladder. The guy can't believe what he's hearing, but she won't take no for an answer. Finally, he tells her she has to go back to her seat, or she will be escorted from the plane. She made a complete ass of herself in front of the whole first-class cabin. Story 25. I had a rough childhood with a drug addict father. My mom struggled to make ends meet, and my first job was paying for the mortgage. After several months of working, again at my first job, I finally had some money to spend on myself and decided to get a computer and a decent internet connection. At the time, the best internet I could buy as part of a dish combo package. I bought a dish and brought it home to install on the house. During this time, my dad was still living at home with us, but he was hardly there, and my parents had all but separated at that point. My dad promptly asked me what I was doing putting a dish on his house. I let him know that I pay the mortgage now, and I make the decisions on what we do with the house. I was young, but it was a very empowering moment for me. Edit. I didn't expect to see all this when I checked Reddit again. I'll try to answer questions and things below. I like the jokes. Probably a coping mechanism. LOL. Edit 2. I see a lot of people talking about the deed and wanted to say something about that. I'm not sure which of my parents' names were on the deed, but what I did know is that if I didn't pay it, it was going to foreclosure. We already had warnings, and it wasn't the first time that had happened. I was young when this all happened and probably didn't even know what a deed or title was at that time. If I stopped paying, we no longer had a house. A constant argument from parents to their kids is that they pay for the roof over your head, so you'll do what they tell you. They rarely say I own the deed. You do what I tell you. Story 26. One of my new employees came from a competitor who is, shall we say, not as put together as we are. Her former boss had actually called me to yell at me about poaching his consultants, which in and of itself is weird enough. However, a few weeks after she started, the dude rolled up to our office. He had apparently been calling her to get her to finish an analysis for him, and she just ghosted him. I went to the lobby to see what he was doing here. He started in on me again, and then she happened to walk by. I didn't fully understand the conversation, but at one point he literally demanded she do this analysis. She just said, "Or what?" and waited a few beats before turning on her heels and walking away. I did the old hand on his back point to the door universal symbol for leave, or a large security man will make you leave. Never heard from him again. Story 27 had an old boss who was a complete and total bastard. He was actually my boss's boss and wasn't supposed to interact with us unless it was through our boss, but he just loved trying to make everyone under him squirm. The company had forced him to go to training twice because of how he spoke to people. One day, I get a call at home from him, and he just starts unloading cursing, name-calling, insulting over some technical issue he just found out about. After a couple of minutes, I just looked at my phone and hung up on him. The next day, I get called into a meeting with his boss, who basically wants to know who I think I am hanging up on this guy. I calmly explain that no one gets to yell at me on my time in my home on my phone. You have to wait for me to be on the clock to pay me for that privilege, and I'll gladly take that money. If I'm busy being yelled at, I'm not busy with anything else. Seemed to work. Edit. Holy hell, the upvotes and awards. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to tell everyone who still cracks jokes about all the Reddit love. Story 28. One of my jobs is in a hotel/restaurant/bar. A guest came into the bar after having been refused service at our sister hotel down the road. He was very drunk and had been rude, abusive, and threatening to the staff. He insisted we serve him as he was a guest, but we'd already been phoned by our sister hotel so they could let us know what the situation was. We refused, but offered him some water and suggested he go up to his room. He then went on about how he had nearly bought our hotel and that he was practically our boss, so we should serve him or he'd have us fired. We refused. He told us he was a very rich man and would tip us hundreds of pounds if we served him. We refused. He was getting abusive at this point, so we again suggested he have some water and head up to his room. He went on to tell us that his brother was the mayor, so we should serve him. We refused and told him he should go on up to his room yet again. He then said he was going to the pub across the street, but all the pubs or restaurants in our town have a barred from them all policy. We telephoned the other pubs to inform them of the situation. Many of them got back to us and said they had been offered money, been threatened with losing their jobs, and also told the story of the mayor. All of the pubs stuck to their guns and refused to serve him. Eventually, he came back to the hotel and went to his room.